The day began with the kind of hush that makes a person believe the world is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Along the packed dirt yard behind the freight office, men pressed against the wooden rails, their eyes sharp with hunger that had nothing to do with food. Coins clinked in restless palms, boots shifted on dust, and the air carried the call of an auctioneer whose voice had been trained to cut through storms. But it was not the voice, nor the silver being wagered, that caught every gaze. It was the woman. She stood tall on the rough platform, shoulders square, as if she dared the crowd to see her without bowing her head. Her braid, tied with leather, held a single feather that lay soft against her shoulder, and though her torn deerskin dress betrayed hardship, her spirit shone brighter than the cold morning sun. Dust clung to her face, yet she made no move to brush it away. It was as though she had decided long ago that nothing, not laughter, not cruelty, not men with money and loud voices, would strip her of her last possession, her pride. In the crowd, Beckett Shaw shifted his weight, the scar on his leg pulling in the chill. He had come to town for nothing more than nails, salt, and winter feed. His coin was carefully counted, his errands plain, his heart set on leaving before noon. But fate is never interested in simple lists. The sight of the auction platform and the woman upon it unsettled him in ways he hadn't felt since the years when his own name had nearly been taken from him. Her eyes, quick and steady, swept across the crowd like a blade, and Beckett felt something stir. A reminder of battles fought and endured, of choices that carved themselves into a man's bones. The sheriff leaned in the shadows, watching without moving, because he knew the law could not stop what men in the yard demanded. Beckett clenched his jaw, telling himself to turn away. It wasn't his business. It wasn't his fight. And yet, when the first bid was thrown, rough laughter spilling from the lips of a ranch hand, he felt the choice land heavy in his chest. He had coin enough. Not for this, not meant for this, but enough. The chant of the auctioneer rolled forward, numbers rising, the crowd leaning, a spectacle feeding on itself. Then Beckett raised his hand. One clear bid, too high for jest and too steady to be ignored. Silence rippled across the yard. The laughter died. The second bidder dropped away, unwilling to bleed his pockets. The hammer fell with a sharp clap. A bill of sale was pressed into Beckett's hand, the ink still damp, the name line blank. Blank, as though she did not exist. His throat burned. Without hesitation, he tore the paper in half and let the scraps fall into the dust. The crowd murmured, uncertain whether to mock or to challenge. Beckett turned, his voice quiet, almost intimate, yet carrying the weight of finality. "You're coming with me." No claim, no boast, only a promise spoken low. The sheriff shifted, a warning and permission in one. The restless energy of violence drained away, for no man wished to test a gun half-drawn at the sheriff's side. Kiona stepped down from the platform, chin level, refusing the false hand offered by a boy eager to play the hero. She walked with her spine unbroken, her pace measured, her dignity intact. Beckett walked beside her, cutting through the crowd that opened too slow, his presence broad, his silence harder than steel. One word meant to stick was thrown at them, but Beckett's glance cut it down before it could take root. Together they reached the horses, the noise of the yard fading behind them, replaced by the sharp clarity of choice. She did not thank him. He did not ask for gratitude. Between them stretched a road that neither had planned, but both would now walk. The first mile held silence, not the kind that weighs heavy, but the kind that heals, where the heart begins to steady after fear, where breath becomes even, where tomorrow waits just ahead. And if you find yourself drawn into this journey, into the quiet strength of a man who risked more than coin, and the unbroken spirit of a woman who refused to bow, then let your heart rest here for a moment. If this story brings a spark of light into your evening, a touch of warmth or healing in your day, I invite you to walk with us further. Leave your thoughts, share your voice, and let this tale reach more hearts. A simple like, a gentle comment, or a small subscribe is more than support. It is a way of saying that stories like these matter, that love born in unlikely places deserves to be remembered. The road out of Copper Bend stretched long and pale beneath the rising sun. Ahead lay miles of silence, danger, and perhaps the fragile beginning of trust. And so, with dust rising behind them and choices written not on paper but in the air between their breaths, they rode on toward a ranch that waited with one door open, a table with space for two, and a future neither had yet dared to name. The town faded behind them, its noise shrinking into nothing more than a faint echo swallowed by the open plains. Dust lifted beneath the horses' hooves and curled away into the morning air, leaving only the sound of steady strides, leather creaking, and the quiet breath of two souls bound together by chance. Kiona held her reins with hands that still stung from rope burns, her shoulders square beneath the borrowed coat Beckett had given her. The fabric carried the scent of smoke, of horse, of something steady and lived in, and though she did not say it aloud, it steadied her chest in a way she had not felt since before the taking. Beckett rode half a length ahead, enough to guard the path, but not so close as to crowd her. His eyes scanned the horizon, always searching, for riders, for dust, for danger that might chase them down. Years of survival had honed him into a man who trusted the silence between hoofbeats more than the loud words of men in yards. And yet, as his hand brushed the stock of his rifle, as his eyes tracked the creek line for movement, another thought kept pulling at him, the image of her standing tall on the platform, unbroken, meeting the weight of men's hunger without bending. It was not pity that had made him raise his hand at the auction. It was recognition. The wind cut cold across the flats, sharp but clean, the kind of air that cleared the chest. Kiona let it fill her lungs and told herself she would not waste this ride on fear. She had known too many days where fear had carved into her bones, where every breath had felt borrowed. Today, though, she held to a new pattern. One thought at a time. Stay upright. Keep her name. Watch him, this stranger who had chosen a different kind of violence, tearing a paper instead of clutching it. When they reached the creek's narrow run, Beckett drew the horses down to drink. He dismounted, boots grinding softly on gravel, and crouched low without making demands. "Let me see," he said, palms open at his sides. No command, no pressure, just space. Kiona studied him in silence, weighing the angle of his body, the distance to his guns, the slope of the bank, before she extended her wrists. Rope burns raw and swollen marked her skin. He slid off his glove with his teeth, opened a small tin of salve, and worked it gently along the torn flesh. His touch was steady, eyes fixed not on her, but on the work, careful not to press too hard, careful not to stray. The healing balm stung and soothed at once, and for the first time since the morning began, she felt the ache in her chest loosen. They shared food where they stood, strips of jerky, a heel of bread, water cold from the canteen. Simple fare, but it quieted the tremor in her legs. He spoke little, only enough to name the miles ahead, enough to point out that if they were followed, the dust would show by the second rise. His words were not promises, not soft lies. They were practical, measured, and they eased her in a way grand speeches never could. She asked him one question then, her voice steady, though the wind nearly carried it off. "Where would I sleep?" "Spare room," he answered without pause. "North wall. Window sticks in the cold, but it lifts. Latch turns from the inside." The detail dropped into her chest like a stone settling into water. A latch she could set herself. A door no one else could command. The simplicity of it made her shoulders ease a fraction more. "You owe me nothing," he added, still watching the horses. "Not coin, not work, not company. Eat, warm yourself, sleep with the door how you want it. In the morning you choose, stage road parson or stay. Any path is yours." He did not glance at her when he said it. He kept his eyes on the reins, his hands where she could see them. It was not an offer gilded with charm. It was freedom, spoken plain. They mounted again and pressed on. The road stretched clean, pale under the sun, and the silence between them shifted. No longer the silence of strangers, it became the silence of people testing the edges of trust. Beckett measured each rise of land, each shadow that might hold threat, while Kiona measured the cadence of his breath, the steadiness of his hands, the way his eyes never once dragged across her in the way other men's had. Each mile they rode became another mile she did not feel hunted. Each mile was a piece of healing stitched into the torn fabric of her spirit. A rider appeared once behind them, a ranch hand with a smile too sharp, testing whether courage could ride alone. Beckett placed his horse between the man and Kiona, spoke few words, and the challenge crumbled into dust as the rider turned back. Kiona exhaled slowly, keeping it quiet. Not thanks, not fear leaving, but something steadier. Proof that the road ahead was still hers to walk. By the time the sun leaned west, the first glimpse of Beckett's ranch came into view, a roofline low against the horizon, cottonwoods marking the creek, a sagging rail waiting to be mended. It was no palace, no grand estate, but to Kiona it was a place with edges she could learn, a house with a door that opened inward, a stove that gave heat, a space where her decisions might finally matter. The dog's bark carried across the yard as they neared, sharp at first, then softening when he caught Beckett's voice. Pike circled them, tail high, then settled into a steady trot beside the horses as if to welcome a pattern already forming. Beckett dismounted, loosened the cinches, and worked the gate with careful hands. He stepped aside, letting her ride through first. The gesture was small, yet it lodged itself in her heart. Inside the yard, the air felt different, quieter, less hostile, touched by the faint scent of bread gone cool. She slid down from the mare on her own, her eyes scanning windows, hinges, door frames, escape routes. Every detail mattered. Every detail said whether she could breathe here. Beckett watched, but did not intrude. He only said, "Water first, then heat." Practical, plain, as if kindness should never be dressed as a debt. The house waited. Its walls carried no voices but their own. The dog settled near the porch, tail thumping once before resting still. Kiona stood on the threshold, her hand brushing the latch. It turned smooth and true, yielding to her alone. And something inside her eased at that touch. Not everything was healed, not yet, but this at least was a beginning. And as the last rays of light slipped across the cottonwoods, she stepped inside, carrying with her not surrender, but the first fragile piece of choice she had been denied for far too long. The first night inside his house was wrapped in a quiet that felt nothing like the yard's silence, nothing like the hush of being watched. It was the quiet of wood breathing against the cold, of a stove pulling steady heat, of a dog curling itself across the doorway like a hinge between rooms. Kiona stood in the middle of the kitchen with her shoulders straight and her eyes sharp, learning every angle, every latch, every window. Beckett set his hat on a peg and stepped aside, giving her space to move, to choose, to test the truth of what he had spoken on the road. No words were needed at first. The house itself was a kind of answer. A small loaf of bread sat beneath a cloth on the table. The smell of beans and salt pork lingered in the air, slow and comforting. On a shelf, only 3 plates and 2 cups. No bottles, no hidden crates, no shadows where lies could hide. The stove ticked faintly as the draught shifted, metal stretching itself against the fire. She crossed into the narrow hall, tried the latch of the spare room, lifted the window sash to test if it would stick as he had said. It did, and then came free under her shoulder. The truth settled in her chest like warm water seeping into chilled hands. He brought her a white shirt, clean cotton bandage, and set them on a chair without looking back as she changed. No intrusion, no weight of eyes, only space. The wool coat remained on the chair in reach if she wished it, but for the first time since dawn she no longer clutched it like a shield. When she emerged, her hair rebraided tight, the feather set smooth, he was bent over the stove, tending the fire with the same plain care he had given the horses. His movements carried no demand, only steadiness. They ate together at the table. He cut the bread into thick slices with a square workman's knife, not sharp for show, but sharp for use. He filled her plate without asking, filled it again when it was empty, as though second helpings were as natural as breathing, not a test of gratitude. She ate with her eyes on the door, the window, then on his hands. His hands did not twitch or wander, they moved only to the stove, the knife, the bread. With each bite her chest eased, her body remembering what it was like to be nourished without expectation. Healing comes in small things. Bread warm on the tongue, steam rising soft, silence that does not press. Afterward, she washed the dust and rope burn from her wrists at the basin he had set with hot water and soap. He did not watch, only checked the damper on the stove again, though it did not need checking, letting her have the moment without eyes measuring her. She tested the latch of her room one more time, then left it unthrown, because leaving it unthrown was her choice. When the light fell low, he trimmed the lamp, set it on the table, and sat with a cedar scrap in his hand, shaping it with a small knife. She sat opposite, her dress mended across her knees, needle drawing thread through torn places made by other hands. The house filled with the soft rhythm of small work, the scrape of knife, the pull of thread, the stove's ticking sigh. Between them, trust was stitched not in words, but in quiet motions. Later, a shutter rattled loose in the wind, and she crossed the hall. He rose from his chair, but did not crowd her. Together they set the hook, his warm hand brushing hers only for the space of a breath. The touch asked nothing, claimed nothing. She leaned her forehead against his collarbone, her body telling her what her mouth had not yet spoken. This moment was hers to name. He bent, and their lips met once. A kiss neither stolen nor demanded. A kiss that healed by its very simplicity. She whispered, "I wanted that," so there would be no mistake. He nodded once. Good. And nothing more shifted between them except the certainty that choice remained in her hands. Night folded around the house with no weight of threat. She lay in the spare bed with the door wide, the quilt pulled across her, her palm resting over the coat she could still grab if she chose. He lay in his own room, his door open, his movements soft, checking window hooks, coughing once, settling. The dog slept across the threshold, a quiet guard that needed no command. For the first time in too many nights, her breath evened into true rest, unbroken, steady. The healing of safety is not loud. It is in the way the body unclenches when it knows no hand will force it awake. Dawn came thin and pale, light sliding across frost on the window. Beckett was already at the stove, coffee dark and rolling, bread sliced, 2 cups set out without hesitation, as though the second had always belonged. On the table lay a small tin ring, plain and light, not offered with demand, but placed where she could see it, where she could decide. She took it into her hand, tested its weight, set it against her finger, then looked not at the ring, but at him. "I want the parson today," she said, her voice steady, her name her own. And so the day bent toward town, toward paper and vows, toward a room where words would be spoken clean and witnessed. The road waited, the horses readied, the sheriff's quiet gaze steady on the boardwalk. What had begun in a yard of dust and hunger would now be written in ink, in choice, in the kind of healing that turns a stranger's house into a place called home. The morning broke with a thin wash of light over the creek, the kind of light that did not blaze but revealed edges of frost on the pump handle, the faint shimmer on the cottonwoods, the pale glint of breath from horses waiting at the hitch. Beckett was already awake, as always, his motions steady. Coffee boiled dark, but not too long this time, bread warming on the stove-board, a knife laid across the table for slicing. Kiona stepped from the spare room with her hair tight in its braid, the deer-hide dress mended by her own hands, and the small feather set once again at her shoulder. She carried herself as she had the day before, proud, careful, but something had changed. The weight in her chest no longer dragged her steps. It moved lighter, as though the first threads of healing had begun to stitch across her ribs. On the table lay the tin ring. Plain, light, without ceremony. Beckett kept his hands away from it, as though to remind her it was not a demand, not a chain. She took it into her palm, turned it once between her fingers, set it against her ring finger where it would sit. Too loose by a fraction, but close enough. Her eyes lifted, not to the ring, but to him. "I want the parson today," she said. Her voice was not loud, not trembling. It carried the quiet certainty of a woman setting her own line in the earth. Beckett nodded once. "All right." The word landed like wood set into place. No flourish, no pressure. He drew the ranch ledger toward him, opened to a blank page, and wrote 2 headings in a straight hand. Names and ages. He passed the pencil across the table. She wrote first. Kiona Shaw, 24. Her name sat there, clean, steady, chosen. He added his own. Beckett Shaw, 41. The page looked like a fence line, freshly set, firm, honest. They sat a moment in silence, watching inkless marks on paper hold the weight of their future. Preparation was plain. He set $3 silver and a handful of smaller coins in a cloth purse. Fee for the clerk, cloth if needed. He dressed without show. Clean work shirt, canvas coat, brushed free of burrs, kerchief tied. He shaved at the basin, quick strokes, so no shadow clung to his jaw. She layered the shirt he had given her beneath her mended dress, the neckline stitched firm under her hands the night before, and pulled the wool coat across her shoulders. The ring he fitted with pliers, careful not to close on her skin until it settled snug. She did not smile, but when she said, "It fits," the air itself eased. The dog was given water and bread, the latch left set but not locked, so he could push it if fire or smoke demanded. Beckett checked his Colt, left it quiet at his hip, and placed 2 rounds in his pocket for the Henry, but left the rifle empty in its rack. Law read rifles before listening to words. Kiona walked the house one last time, palm brushing latch, window, trunk, as though memorizing her new map. Then she stepped onto the porch and looked at the sky. Hard blue, no storm signs. "Good day," she murmured, and Pike barked once in agreement. The ride into Copper Bend was quiet, both listening for hoofbeats not their own. The town was just stirring, wagons clattering at the freight office, thin smoke curling from the cafe chimney. Sheriff Raines stood on the boardwalk rail, hat low, eyes sharp. He watched as they dismounted at the courthouse, Beckett tying reins with quick, clean knots. He gave her the post nearest the door so she could step in or out without brushing a crowd. "Straight in," he said, voice level. Inside, the clerk looked up from a ledger, his face already bored. Beckett laid the cloth purse on the counter. "License." The clerk opened the ledger with burnt corners. "Names, ages, residence," he droned. Beckett stepped back half a pace so Kiona's voice would carry first. "Kiona Shaw, 24. 12 miles north at the bend, Stonewell." She spoke steady, not glancing away. The clerk scratched it down without lifting his eyes. Beckett gave his own in turn. "Witnesses?" the clerk asked. "Parsons' wife," Beckett answered. "Sheriff Raines, if his time allows." At that, the clerk looked up for the first time, a half-smirk tugging at his lips, but he swallowed it when he saw the 2 of them standing square, shoulders level. He counted out the fee. Beckett did not take the paper. Kiona folded it once, slid it into her coat. Her hand rested there over her heart. Her name lived in ink now, where no man could bend it. Outside, 2 ranch hands loitered at the far end of the boardwalk, shoulders spread to look larger. One muttered about price and property. Sheriff Raines stepped between them, voice flat. "The judge's desk is that way. You got a claim, file it. Otherwise, keep your mouths shut." He did not touch his gun. He did not need to. The words carried weight enough. The hands looked for eyes to back them and found none. They spat in the dust and drifted off. Kiona did not flinch. She did not step behind Beckett. She stood level with him, paper pressed against her breastbone, shawl firm across her shoulders. The parson's house waited at the end of the street, plain and square, sign reading, "Weddings, funerals, Thursdays." His wife opened the door before they could knock, shawl over her arm, pen ready, kindness in her eyes. She set the shawl on Kiona's shoulders, not as gift, but as warmth. The parson asked his questions plain. Pressure? No. Understanding the law? Yes. Name spoken? Clear. The ring placed in the parson's hand so no fumbling marred the moment. Kiona answered first when asked, I do. Steady, without a shake. Beckett answered after. The ring slid onto her finger, seated clean where they had sized it that morning. The parson's wife smiled, a small breath of satisfaction at a ceremony done without stumbling. Signatures followed. Hers first, his next, witnesses after. The sheriff wrote slow, careful, so no clerk could pretend it was unreadable. The parson pressed seal to paper, red wax marking the union. He handed the copy to Kiona, not Beckett. Keep this with the other things that matter. She folded it once, slid it against her chest, where warmth and heartbeat guarded it. When they stepped back into the street, the town looked the same. Wagons rattling, dogs barking, smoke rising. Yet for them, everything had changed. The boardwalk no longer felt like a place of judgment. It was simply wood underfoot. The noise was simply life. Their names were written now, fixed where no crowd could tear them down. Sheriff Rains tipped his hat, saying only, "Ride on." No blessing, no sermon, just the naming of the next step. Beckett answered, "Much obliged." Kiona glanced once at the parson's wife, who lifted her chin in return, a woman's silent benediction. They rode out of Copper Bend with steady pace, no lingering, no pause for the cafe. By the second rise, the noise of town had thinned to a scrape of wheels far behind. Ahead stretched the road, pale under winter sun, leading them back to a house where 2 plates and 2 cups waited, to a dog who barked when he heard their scent, to land that had learned the sound of their names. Healing does not come all at once, but in the steady laying down of truth, in paper signed clean, in rings worn by choice, in doors latched from the inside. And as the cottonwoods bent to the wind and the ranch roof came into sight, both knew this was not the end of the story, but the beginning of one spoken under their own voices, written line by line in the quiet steadiness of days to come. The return to the ranch carried none of the weight that had marked the ride into town. The dust behind them was not pursuit, but distance, the kind that settles matters instead of raising them. Pike's bark lifted across the yard as they came into view, sharp at first, then dropping into the low huff of recognition. The house stood as they had left it, porch rail catching late light, smoke thread curling from the chimney, corral rails sagging in the same place that had waited too long for repair. Yet the air felt different. They had left with questions. They came back with paper, with vows spoken clean, with their names joined not by chains, but by choice. Beckett swung down first, loosened cinches with the practiced motion of a man who measured life by chores done right the first time. Kiona stepped down without waiting for his hand, her movement steady, her coat swinging soft against her legs. She touched the mare's neck once, a gesture both farewell and thanks, before turning to the well bucket. Together they watered the horses, not speaking because the rhythm of rope and hooves, of mouths dipping to drink, said enough. Healing was there in the ordinariness of it, not in grand words, but in work done side by side, each task neither commanded nor owed. Inside, the stove still held a trace of yesterday's fire, and the smell of beans lingered faint under the new scent of coffee he had set before they left. She slipped the sealed paper into the cedar box he had built, set it beneath the mended dress folded square, and closed the lid. Her palm rested there a long moment, not because she doubted, but because she wanted the feel of weight in her hand. Paper is light, yet it carries more than iron. When she let go, her shoulders eased. That chapter was settled. He reached for hammer and bracewood, walking toward the corral with a bucket of nails. She followed without asking, a handful of nails cradled in her palm. Together they lifted the sagging rail. He pressed shoulder into the weight. She braced it with her own, and when his hammer drove the nails home, she felt the jolt run not just through the wood, but through her chest. They tested it twice, then stepped back. The rail held straight, small work, yet it changed the look of the whole pen. Sometimes healing looks like mending rails, like setting something upright that has leaned too long. The rest of the afternoon unfolded with that same plain rhythm. She beat the dust from her deerskin dress across the porch rail, clipped fringe, rethreaded a bead. He sanded a door shim until it fit flush, so the shed would stop catching. She boiled bandages, rinsed them, hung them in a strip of sunlight, then rubbed salve into wrists no longer raw, but still tender. He checked fences, tapping wire with his glove, while she laid string in the patch of earth that would soon hold beans. She sang low, a tune her grandmother had taught for steady hands, and though Beckett could not catch the melody, he listened from the shed, letting the sound settle into the air like something meant to belong. Pike stretched himself in the furrow, convinced the song was his. Kiona laughed once, a sound rare but true, and the land itself seemed to answer. Toward evening, Sheriff Rains rode in slow, his hat tipped back, his eyes lined from years of watching men's worst choices. He tied his horse without flourish, stepped to the rail, and said only, "You'll want to know." His words came like stones set one by one. The two ranch hands had taken work east, pride too bruised to linger. The auction yard was done selling flesh. From now on it would hold cattle and mules, nothing else. The law had drawn its line, and the judge would sign if need be. Then he looked at Kiona, not past her, not through her, but at her. "If anyone puts your name in his mouth to harm it, you tell me first." No sermon, no pity, just the plain promise of a man tired of winter fights. She met his gaze, nodded once, and filed him under useful, not savior. He rode off without staying for supper. The sound of his horse faded, leaving behind a yard steadier than before. That night the house breathed easier. The latch was hers to throw or not. She left it unthrown because leaving it was her decision. The ring sat snug on her finger, removed only when she washed, then slipped back on as she chose. She folded the shawl the parson's wife had draped on her shoulders and hung it on a peg by the door, no longer a shield, but a house thing now. Beckett sliced bread, poured beans into bowls, and when her plate was empty, he filled it again without asking. No test, no tally. Food was food. They sat on the porch bench he had begun carving into shape. He on the right, out of habit, she on the left, where she could see the gate. Pike sprawled across the threshold, the self-appointed keeper of doors. The creek murmured beyond the cottonwoods, loosening the last ice of winter. They spoke little, for heavy talk had been spent already. What remained were the kinds of words that make a life, whether to plant beans in 3 rows or 4, whether the lame heifer might come sound, whether she wanted the shawl peg low or high. Each answer carried no weight but the comfort of choice. As night pressed close, she closed her door once, left it open the next, tested the air both ways. Neither choice was about him, both were hers. Healing lay in the freedom to decide again and again without fear of punishment. She sang low once more, a tune for her own ears, and the dog lifted his head as if to listen. Beckett said nothing, only let the sound rest between them. The days bent themselves into rhythm, fence checked, bread baked. Soil turned. Cloth chosen in town, after she had weighed it between finger and thumb, the clerk using her name without pause because it was written now in his ledger. No smirk, no delay. Her name had weight. Neighbors began to nod as they passed, not with curiosity, but recognition. Paper pinned in the courthouse was proof enough for anyone who asked. One evening, as the creek ran full and the cottonwoods flushed green, she leaned her shoulder into his and said quietly, "No more running." He answered in the same steady tone, "No more being taken." The words needed no embroidery. They were lines set firm, strong because they were plain. The cedar box on the shelf held their papers. The latch on the door turned in her hand. The ring circled her finger at her will. Healing had not erased scars, but it had built something steadier, a home where her choices stood unbent, where his silence meant safety, where days unfolded like threads woven into cloth, ordinary, strong, warm. And as night fell over the ranch, the lamp burning low, the sound of 2 breaths filled the house with a quiet that asked for nothing more than tomorrow. The days that followed settled into a rhythm so steady it began to feel like a second heartbeat, one that belonged not to a single body, but to the house itself. Morning rose with the sound of Beckett's boots against the floorboards, the scrape of the stove's damper, the hiss of water poured into the kettle. Kiona would wake to that music and to the low thump of Pike's tail against the doorway, as if the dog already understood she was part of the house's breathing. She would braid her hair by the small mirror, slip the mended dress over the shirt he had given her, and step into the kitchen where 2 tin cups already sat waiting. The sight of both cups, always 2, never 1, was a quiet balm, a healing so subtle it reached her more deeply than grand gestures ever could. Their meals were not feasts but sustenance made into something more. Bread, beans, strips of jerky softened in broth, apples dried and rehydrated, each portion given without condition. When her plate emptied, his hand refilled it, not with ceremony, but as though there had never been a question of whether she deserved it. That absence of doubt, that quiet acceptance, was its own kind of tenderness. And as she ate, she found herself letting her shoulders drop, her breath deepen, her guard ease 1 notch more. Work filled the daylight hours, but not the kind of work that chained or bruised. He cut fence posts with careful strokes, his body moving with the efficiency of a man who had learned that nothing gained was worth the waste of energy. She planted beans in straight rows, laying twine to keep her lines true, humming the low melody her grandmother had once taught. The sound carried softly over the yard, blending with the crack of his hammer or the rasp of his saw. Healing lived in that harmony, 2 voices of labor, different but joined, each making the day whole. Pike would follow her into the rows, flopping his ribs into the furrow as though to claim one patch as his own. She laughed at his foolishness, a sound unguarded, light, surprising even herself. Beckett would glance over then, not smiling broadly, but with the faintest shift of his eyes that told her he heard the sound and cherished it. In the afternoons, when the sun slanted across the cottonwoods, they would walk the edges of the property together. He showed her the weak points of the fence, the low ground that would turn slick in rain, the line of willows along the creek that would need trimming come spring. She touched each place, learning it into her hands, making the land not a cage, but a map she could read for herself. Sometimes their fingers brushed when they passed tools, when he steadied a board she carried, when she placed nails in his palm. Each touch was deliberate in its restraint, no grasp, no demand, only a warmth that lingered long after the skin parted. Evenings belonged to the small rituals of belonging. She would set her salve on the shelf by the stove, so it was always within reach without needing to ask. He would hang his hat on the same peg, boots set heel to heel by the door, a pattern that told her he lived with order, not chaos. They spoke lightly then, not about wounds or law, but about beans sprouting, about whether the dog favored the porch or the hearth, about whether the well rope needed reversing before summer. Such talk, ordinary to the ear, was extraordinary to her heart. Each word laid another stone in the foundation of safety. At night, the choices remained hers. Some nights she left the door wide, breathing with the soft sounds of the house, the lamp glow spilling into her room. Other nights she closed it, feeling the firmness of the latch turn under her palm, a simple act that carried the weight of reclamation. Each morning she opened it again by her own decision, and each time she found him where he said he would be, boots on, stove stoked, coffee brewing. Promises kept not once, but daily became their own kind of vow. There was a night when wind rattled the shutters and pulled a groan from the beams. She crossed the hall to find him at the table, lamp turned low, cedar shavings scattered across the wood where he had been carving. He looked up, but did not rise too fast, only nodded once as if to say, "You are seen, not cornered." They went to the window together, his hand brushing hers only to catch the hook before it bit his knuckles. That small warmth steadied her more than any oath. She leaned her forehead to his collarbone, and he let her. No weight pressed her, no hand claimed her neck. Only the smell of wood smoke, the quiet of steady breath, the healing of a body allowed to rest against another without fear. When she lifted her face, he bent just enough, and their lips met again. Soft, measured, a kiss that asked nothing beyond itself. She whispered, "I wanted that." His reply was one word, "Good." No claim, no expectation. And in that spareness lived a trust deeper than promises gilded with silver. They returned to the table then, not to speak of futures, but to mend, to sand, to share the silence of people who had already said enough. The house held its warmth through the night. She left her door wide again, slept with one palm on the quilt, the other resting lightly over the cedar box where their papers lay folded. Not because she feared their loss, but because she wanted to feel the weight of what had been chosen, what had been written, what no man could take back. Her breath evened into true rest. the kind that heals ribs from the inside out. His movements in the other room, turning once, coughing lightly, checking window hooks, reassured her more than lullabies. The dog shifted across the threshold, the steady hinge of the house. By dawn, the first notes of spring crept into the air. Ice thinned on the creek. Birds tested their throats with cautious calls. She rose before he called her, braided her hair with slower hands, not in haste, but in peace. When she stepped into the kitchen, he slid the bread across the table, already sliced, coffee poured into both cups. No words were needed. She sat opposite, the ring catching the early sun, the shawl at her shoulders folded neatly on the peg, the house holding the sound of 2 breaths moving in rhythm. The healing was not complete, nor was it ever meant to be, but it had begun, steady and sure, growing with each shared task, each meal, each silence respected. And as the light lifted over the cottonwoods, both of them knew the road ahead would not be walked alone. The day waited with its work, fences to mend, fields to seed, neighbours to face. And somewhere within it, a deeper promise, spoken not in vows, but in the simple act of living side by side, was already taking root. The season turned slowly, almost without notice at first, but each day carried its own quiet proof. The creek shed its last skin of ice, water running free and clear, and the cottonwoods along its banks began to glow faintly green at the tips. The air softened, losing its bite, and the ground warmed enough to take seed. Life pushed forward in rhythms that could not be stopped, and the ranch seemed to breathe with it. Kiona rose earlier now, not from fear, but from habit born of peace. She tied her braid with the leather strip she had kept since before the yard, feather set back where it had always belonged. Each morning she stepped into the kitchen and found 2 cups waiting, the stove already coaxing the room into warmth. Beckett did not look up each time. He was not a man who demanded gratitude with his gaze, but she felt his awareness in the way he shifted the bread to her side, the way his movements left her space at the table. Silence had ceased to be an emptiness. It had become a language between them, filled with steadiness, with the healing weight of being known without being asked. The days stretched long with work. Together they walked the fence line, his gloves testing wire while she counted posts aloud, her voice steady against the wind. Sometimes her hand brushed his as she passed a nail. Sometimes his shoulder pressed hers as they lifted a rail into place, and each brief touch carried no urgency, no threat, only the warmth of partnership. She planted beans in the small patch by the back wall, marking the rows with string pulled taut. Her song, low, wordless, old as her grandmother's voice, rose with each stroke of the hoe. Pike sprawled in the furrow, belly pressed to the earth, as if to claim the row as his own. Beckett, mending a hinge in the shed, paused once to listen, though he did not let his eyes linger long. The sound alone was enough, a soft current carrying through the yard, stitching it whole. Evenings drew them close again. She sat at the table, mending the last tear in her dress, while he carved cedar with slow, deliberate cuts. The house smelled of wood shavings and bread cooling beneath cloth. Pike settled at the door, the hinge between rooms, his breathing the only rhythm beside their own. Sometimes their eyes met across the lamplight, and no words were spoken, but the air between them filled with the steady hum of something growing, something chosen. One night, as the wind bent branches against the eaves, she closed her door for the first time since their return from town. She turned the latch firmly under her palm, then lay down with her hand resting on the quilt, her breath even. Closing it was not fear, it was choice. In the other room, Beckett moved softly, his boots set heel to heel, his window checked, his door left wide. He did not test her door, did not question her choice. That trust settled deeper than any spoken vow. When morning came, she opened the door again, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Healing is not always a single turning. It is the freedom to turn each day anew. Neighbours began to appear. Mrs. Dayton rode in with a jug of milk tied in a towel, her dog circling Pike as if testing rank. She looked at Kiona plainly, not prying, but seeing. "You'll want cloth that doesn't fight you," she said, and offered a bolt of brown too stiff for her boys. Kiona answered steady, "I'll come by tomorrow and choose." The words felt right in her mouth, not borrowed, but owned. Later, when Beckett set the milk on the shelf, he did not comment, only nodded once, as if to say, "The house has space for what you choose to bring." Their bond grew in such plain exchanges. He asked her one evening if the shawl peg should sit lower, since her reach was shorter than his. She studied the wall, then said, "Keep it high. I like the stretch." He nodded, driving the nail where she wanted. It was such a small thing, but it lingered. Proof that her voice had weight, that her wishes shaped the space around her. The healing of her spirit was not in one grand act, but in the accumulation of these choices, each respected, each preserved. One evening, when the frogs began their chorus by the creek, she leaned against him on the porch bench, shoulder to shoulder. The dog sprawled at their feet, tail thumping lazily. She spoke softly, almost to herself. "No more running." The words fell like water over stone, settling deep. Beckett's reply came in the same quiet tone. No more being taken. No oath, no flourish, just two truths, set side by side. They did not need to speak further. The silence that followed was fuller than words could carry, warmed by their nearness, healed by its honesty. They filed a small brand with both names, rode to town for cloth she had chosen by hand, needles she had measured between finger and thumb. The clerk spoke her name without pause, because it was written now in his ledger, pinned to the courthouse board. No smirk followed, no delay. Her name had become a fact too solid to twist. That night, she stitched her name into the corner of a cloth lining for the cedar box, letters small but strong. She placed the papers inside, the torn bill of sale beneath, and shut the lid with her own hand. By then, the ranch had learned the sound of their two voices, not clashing, but braided together like her hair, feather resting soft against her shoulder. Meals were eaten in quiet harmony, plates filled and refilled without question. Work was done side by side, her laughter rising when Pike dug his ribs into the bean rows, his low voice rumbling in answer. Nights were spent with doors sometimes wide, sometimes closed, but always her choice. And in the stillness of those nights, when her breath evened and his moved steady in the other room, the house itself seemed to exhale, holding them both in its warmth. The land was no longer a backdrop of survival. It had become theirs, not through claim or coin alone, but through each small act of care, each word spoken plain, each silence respected. Healing had woven itself into the very boards of the house, into the soil that held her rose, into the cedar box with its folded papers, into the steady press of his shoulder against hers on the porch bench. And as spring spread across the plains, the horizon no longer looked like a boundary. It looked like a promise, open, unbroken, wide enough to hold the life they were already shaping together. By the time spring settled fully on the land, the ranch had taken on a rhythm that felt like breath shared between two souls. The cottonwoods along the creek stood tall, their branches dusted with fresh green, whispering in the wind like voices that had always known patience. The bean rows stretched neat and straight, sprouting tender shoots that leaned toward the sun. Work filled the hours, but it no longer felt like labor meant to scrape survival from stubborn ground. It was the work of building, of steadying, of shaping a place where two lives could grow in tandem. Healing lived in every post set straight, in every loaf baked, in every quiet evening shared without the weight of unspoken fear. Kiona moved through the days with a lightness that surprised her still. There were moments when her body remembered old wounds, when the memory of rough hands or the sound of mocking laughter tried to rise. But here, those shadows thinned like mist under the sun. She watered seedlings, her song weaving through the yard, not for courage this time, but because joy wanted to be voiced. Pike sprawled belly up in the furrows, tail thumping, and her laughter carried clean across the field. Beckett, leaning against the fence he had just braced, let the sound wash over him like rain after drought. He did not call attention to it, did not break it with words, but inside him something loosened, something that had been waiting too long for such a sound. Evenings on the porch became their sanctuary. The bench he had built with his own hands now held the shape of her body on the left side, the right side his by habit. Sometimes she leaned into him, her head brushing his shoulder. Sometimes she sat apart, her gaze on the horizon, the silence between them full and warm. He would whittle cedar, she would stitch cloth, and Pike would rest at their feet, as though keeping the day's work sealed. The creek hummed beyond the cottonwoods, frogs lifting their voices, the first stars pricking through twilight. Home was not spoken of, it was lived in the quiet of those hours, in the steady rhythm of breath and heartbeat and trust. The townsfolk, once watchful with their whispers, now treated her presence as fact. At the mercantile she chose cloth by touch, needles by weight, thread by colour, her name spoken without hesitation because it was written in ledgers and pinned on boards. No one questioned, no one delayed. The sheriff's presence at the parson's desk, the witness lines in ink, had settled the matter. Beckett walked beside her, not in front of her, not behind, and the tilt of his head when others glanced their way told the truth better than words. Hers was not a shadow to his step, but a stride beside. There were small things that marked the healing most. The way she closed her door at night, then opened it again by choice. The way she wore the ring some days and left it on the cedar box others, always on her terms. The way her laughter came easier, her voice steadier, her body no longer braced for intrusion. The way he let her shape the house with her hands. A shawl peg placed where she wanted it. A trunk arranged to hold her few things. A window left open or shut without comment. These were not grand gestures, but the stitching of life into something strong, something that could not be torn apart by wind or cruelty. One morning, as the sun lifted clear and bright, she walked to the bean rows with a small pail, her steps steady, her song rising low, Beckett joined her with a post on his shoulder, setting it straight while she bent to tend seedlings. Their movements formed a pattern, quiet and seamless. She paused, leaning on her hoe, and said, "This land listens." He looked up, squinting against the sun, and nodded. "It does, and it remembers." That was enough. Words beyond would have only weakened the truth already present. By summer's crest, the ranch bore their mark in every corner. The corral rails held firm, the shed door swung without catching. The house smelled of cedar and bread and smoke. The cedar box on the shelf, lined with her stitched cloth, kept the papers folded neat, the torn bill of sale buried beneath proof of her name written clean. She touched it sometimes, not out of fear, but to feel the weight of a story turned from wound to witness. It no longer owned her. She owned it, stored in cedar, sealed with her hand. At night, when the air grew soft and fireflies flickered across the yard, she sat with Beckett under the cottonwoods. She would hum the low tune she had once used to steady trembling hands, but now it carried lightness instead of pain. He would listen, quiet, his rough palm resting open on his knee, never reaching unless she placed her hand there. Sometimes she did. Sometimes she let the song fill the space instead. Either way, the air between them held no demand, only warmth. When storms gathered on the horizon, they prepared together. Shutters fastened, water hauled, wood stacked. Rain came hard and wild, rattling roof and rail, but the house held. Inside, she pressed her palm to the latch, the iron cool and firm, and breathed in the safety of walls that sheltered by choice, not by force. He trimmed the lamp low, Pike huffed against the floorboards, and the storm passed. Healing, she thought, was not the absence of storms, but the knowing that walls would hold, that doors would not betray, that names written in paper and in hearts would remain. In time, neighbors came not with questions but with invitations. Sacks of flour traded for help mending fences, milk jars swapped for bread. Mrs. Dayton spoke of cloth she could not use, and Kiona chose bolts by touch, washing them twice to soften. Her voice found place among women at the boardwalk, not loud, not seeking, but steady. When her laughter rose in their company, no one turned it sharp. They let it live, and that was enough. Late one evening, as the sky burned down into violet and the land cooled under a soft wind, Beckett set aside his carving and said one word: "Home." He did not look at her as if to test her answer. He said it because it was true for him, and he left it open. She leaned her shoulder to his, the ring catching the last gleam of light. "Home," she echoed, her voice carrying both weight and release. Healing was not a destination reached with fanfare. It was this: two voices naming the same place, the same breath, the same future. And if you, listening to their story, have felt even a small ember of warmth, a touch of comfort in the thought that love can be built from choice, that wounds can find rest in trust, that healing is stitched day by day into the fabric of ordinary living, then let your heart linger here. If this journey has eased you, even for a moment, I invite you to share your thoughts, to let your voice join ours. A simple like, a gentle comment, or a quiet subscribe is not just a gesture. It is a way of saying that stories of resilience and tenderness matter, that light belongs where shadows once held sway. Let us keep carrying these tales together, so that love chosen freely, lived daily, is never forgotten.